So let me get this screen sharing going here, and we'll be good to go. Hi there, everyone. My name is Scott Nicholson, and I am coming to you from across the water over at, hey, you waved back. Hooray, you actually move. Coming to you from Syracuse University, which is in upstate New York. It is about 5 hours away from New York City, so we are where the cows are. In fact, what is going on right now is the Great State Fair of New York, where we have lots of people coming together to see things like butter sculptures and cars and cows and country and Western music. So that's some excitement. We actually started classes here today with students, so things are pretty crazy. So my goal today in the 20 minutes I have to speak is really to talk a little bit about not only badges, but other forms of gamification. So I'm going to be going talk a little bit about gamification and then go beyond that. Can you all see the slides okay? Yes, give me a thumbs up. Everyone give me a thumbs up if you can see slides. Yay, thumbs up, okay. So I used to run a game lab called the Library Game Lab of Syracuse, but now it's called Because Play Matters, and what we look at is making transformative learning in informal learning environments. So we do stuff like later this week, we're doing a game jam at a local science museum where we're going to have teenagers making games in the museum for museum exhibits. We're doing this in one day. We do this kind of stuff. But what I'm going to talk about today, a little bit about gamification, some of the problems with reward-based gamification, meaningful gamification, and we'll then break it and take some time for questions at that point. So the idea here, the gamification definition I'm going to use, it's the use of game design elements in non-game contexts. There's a lot more you could add to this definition. You could add in definitions elements of engaging users and solving problems. You could add in elements focusing on marketing. Oxford Dictionary is focusing on the marketing aspect of it. But I really like this simple definition of using game design elements in non-game contexts. The idea is that something is going on in the real world, and you're going to add a game layer to it. It's different from game-based learning. Game-based learning is where you have a simulation activity, but you're not actually doing something in the real world. So, for example, in this case with Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, you're not actually a detective chasing Carmen Sandiego around. That's not really happening. Instead, it's this game where you're learning through it. Civilization is another game a lot of instructors like to use. You're not actually waging battles as you do this stuff. With gamification, you're taking something that's actually going on in the real world, and you're adding a layer to it. In fact, the class I'm teaching this semester is called Adding Game Layers to the Real World, because that's the idea of adding game layers through gamification. So what do we mean by game design elements? Well, before we get there, we need to talk about what is a game. Now, I could talk about this for a long time, but again, I like simple definitions. This is my favorite definition, that a game is a form of play with goals and structure. It has three things that are important: play, goals, and structure. Most gamification elements that you know about, what they do is they add goals. So they take something you're doing in the real world, and in order to motivate you to do those things in the real world, they add some goals. And this ties into the concept of Bernard Suits talked about, that the definition of a game, and part of what you do in a game is you take on unnecessary obstacles. You play a game because you want to be challenged in life, because you want to take on some sort of extra challenge. And gamification systems that you may have seen are this structure needed to facilitate this pursuit of goals. At the end of the day, many traditional gamification systems are about rewards, giving people something to get them to do something. So this is your gamification 101. If you can apply this stuff, you too can become a gamification expert, and you can sell your services and make lots and lots of money. So what you do is you take something in the real world, you add a game-like goal, you develop a structure to support this goal, and then you add a reward. This is the basic structure. Some gamification systems that are out there, or you've got Foursquare. You may have used Foursquare. What that does is give you a series of badges and things like that to encourage you to visit locations. What you're seeing on the bottom part of the screen is a system in the US called Zamzy. The idea of Zamzy is that it is a USB device that it's also a pedometer. And so you give it to a kid who carries it around as they exercise. And as they exercise, they earn points and earn badges. And they can exchange those points and badges for rewards. But the parent has had to purchase the rewards ahead of time from Zamzy. So the parent pays Zamzy for toys, the kid exercises, and then the kid earns the toys. So what happens is the kid is rewarded for doing exercise. Put that in the back of your head, because we're going to come back to that a little bit later. Now, gamification systems have been around for a long time. If you're from the US, you may have seen these things. These are S&H green stamps. These have been around for decades. Whenever you bought something at a store, you'd get these stamps. You would collect them in books. You could then turn them in for valuable prizes. And the idea was to build loyalty. Loyalty programs are something we've seen a lot of, and something that the airlines and hotels and casinos have been around in loyalty programs. And if your wallets are anything like American wallets, you probably have a whole bunch of cards that look like this that represent all these different loyalty systems and all these game elements you are willing to engage with. And these are ways of getting you to be loyal to a company. McDonald's has actually done this quite well. Their McDonald's Monopoly is one of their strongest themes. And so the idea here is it's a basic set collection game that you get by buying hamburgers. So we've been doing this kind of stuff for a long time. It's not anything new. It has a new name, this gamification name, but we've been at it for a while. In fact, we've been at it for a long while. We've been giving people badges for a very long time to reward and motivate specific types of behavior. In fact, Napoleon figured this out, and he said that a soldier will fight long and hard for a bit of colored ribbon. Well, now we might want to think a student will fight long and hard for a bit of a badge or a bit of a grade in a standardized test. So this is all tied into here. In fact, grades are a gamification system. If you think about the whole grading system, the idea is it's this game layer on top of this real world activity of learning. In my class I'm teaching on gamification, I'm using this example and making the students make their own game layer on top of course content. They're making their own grading systems because I want them to understand grades are just badges. They're a universal badge. We all know what these grade systems are. They're shared between classes, but they're a way of badging certain types of things. So we've been at this for a while. So we're just changing around the names and adding some new layers. So I wanted to have a name for referring to this sort of gamification, and what I call is BLAP gamification. There's 4 elements in BLAP. It's the 4 letters in the word BLAP: badges, levels and leaderboards, achievements, and points. So let's talk about how these things work together. So first you have points. Points are how you control people. The points are actually, if you think a bit broader about game design, many times the way a game designer controls the behavior of their player is by giving them points. Those are the rewards that they get. And they can then choose to take those points away as well. They could also offer penalties. If you think about in games that you would have points on one hand and penalties on the other hand. So with traditional, take old style video games, you'd get points for doing things. You would lose lives for doing bad things. That was your penalty, and the game designer controlled your behavior. Nowadays, we don't have lives. Our penalty is time. Most of our games penalize you by forcing you to redo sections of the game, which then takes time. So game designers today use points and time in order to penalize people or to change their behavior. It is frustrating for you as a player. A game that is not a good game for you can be a game that doesn't reward what you want to do. And you have to mentally shift off and say, all right, I'm not going to worry about points. I'm going to do what's fun for me. So a match between a player and the game, part of that is, does the game reward the kind of play you want to do? But anyway, so points are at the heart of this gamification process. Now, one way of quantifying those points is through levels. The idea is that as you do better in the system, you go up levels, and these levels indicate how strong you are in the system. It can be easier to say, I am a 20th level wizard, than to say, I have 8,262 experience points. So it just makes it an easy way to talk about your character. You can also map those points to competition between other players through leaderboards. And so with leaderboards, they allow people to see how they are, to see how they're ranked against other people. In theory, these are supposed to be motivational. I have found in reality, not so much, but we'll talk about that later. Achievements are, in my opinion, the most interesting part of these systems, because achievements allow you additional paths to explore the game space that aren't necessarily related to points or the goal of the game. Achievements are actually the most playful part of this system, because they're encouraging people to do stuff outside of the normal game space, to play, to explore, to have fun. And then you have badges. So badges are the public display element of any of these things. The idea is the badges can display publicly some aspect of the levels or the leaderboards or the points or achievements or goals of the game. So as you earn these badges, people then can learn something about you by looking at the badges, and they can get a better idea of what's going on. Now, when I started doing research on gamification, this book, the O'Reilly book, I read this quote, and this quote stopped me cold in what I was doing. Once you start giving someone a reward, you have to keep her in that reward loop forever. Now, if you are a gamification consultant, hooray, this is fantastic. That's great, great news. If you are, say, a library with a limited budget and you're interested in trying gamification to get people motivated, this is a problem. And this is why I got into this line of research. When I read this line, I said, oh, crap, I've got to tell people about this. I've got to help them realize that once they start gamification, they stuck in this forever. And I wanted to figure out why. And I began digging at the theories of why this was. And it comes down to part of it is out of the self-determination theory by DC and Ryan, and this balance of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. There's stuff that we do because it's inside of us, and we want to do that stuff, and there's stuff that we do for rewards. And having a different context around these things can make you feel better about life or can make you feel not so good about life. But there's three things that are at the core of what makes us feel good about life, and that is autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy is when you have some sort of control about what's going on, some sort of choice. Competence is when you feel that you are establishing a lot of knowledge about a field, that's mastery. And relatedness, there's people around you that you can engage with. You're feeling comfortable in this space. These are things we want to try and improve and increase. Now, this book, if you haven't looked at this book, I strongly recommend it if you're thinking about getting into gamification, Punished by Rewards by Alfie Kohn. If you want a corporate look at this concept, read the book Drive by Daniel Pink. But the idea here is it looks at this concept of how rewards cause problems. I'll give you one example. DC found that he allowed people to do puzzles, and they either did the puzzles for fun, and these are all people that like to do puzzles. He took some people, gave them money for doing puzzles. He took other people, let them do puzzles for fun. Later on, he introduced the puzzles again, and he found the people that did puzzles for money no longer wanted to do puzzles. The people that did puzzles for fun wanted to come back to them. Lepper found this with preschoolers and magic markers. He looked at kids, and the kids had access to all these art supplies, and he said, which ones like magic markers? And he picked those kids out. Then he pulled those kids in, and he said, okay, you guys, I'm going to give you rewards for you drawing pictures with magic markers. And then he did that, let them try with the magic markers, and then release them back. And then a while later, reintroduced the kids to the same environment. And what he found is the kids who went to magic markers initially now wanted nothing to do with them. So what's going on here is rewards replace your pre-existing interest in something. If you say want to read a book, and a library gives you a reward for reading a book, you are now going to be less likely to want to read a book without a reward. Well, this is a problem. Let's take a moment and reflect. So if rewards undermine internal motivation, once you start giving someone a reward and you have to keep them in that loop forever, well, what happens? You have library systems now that where, and I teach in a school of library science that come out of that area, where the whole library is rewarding all these behaviors. Well, what happens then? Think about Zamzi that we talked about earlier. You have kids who want to do some exercise. You then decide to reward them for doing exercise. Then as they get older, they no longer have those rewards. In libraries, what we see in the US, we have these summer reading programs that are reward-based, where kids get rewards for reading books. And then we look to see what age group is the least likely to come in a library, and it's teenagers after they age out of these summer reading programs. We see this again and again. If we reward behaviors and then those rewards go away, there's a problem. So I got to thinking about it. Is there another way to do it? And so I took that definition of games equals play plus structure and goals, and I flipped it around, and I subtracted play from both sides. And what I found is that games without play, whoopee, is external motivation, and that's these rewards. So what if we change this formula? Instead, we add play to both sides. We have games without structure or goals is play. What if we figure out how to make the tasks meaningful and avoid external rewards that replace intrinsic motivation? So I've worked on this area called meaningful gamification, where you're trying to build up that internalized motivation instead of just focusing on those rewards. Now, if you want to see the theories behind it, theories, I've got them for you. If you go to my website at becauseplaymatters.com, click on the publications link, you'll find a theoretical framework article that talks about all this stuff, but I don't have the time to go into that here. But the idea here is that you want to give the player information about what they're doing. You want to inform them. You want to put the concept of playing back into player. You want to give the player choices. You want to make informed play the reward and use external rewards like badges sparingly, if at all, and put the player's benefits first in the design, not the organization benefits first. That's one of the big problems I see is organizations put their benefits first instead of the player's benefits. And I say flip that around. Help the players have the benefits first. And those of you thinking about doing citizen science projects where you're using players out there and you're giving them badges instead of giving them money to have them do menial tasks, is that a good thing? Is that going to churn their interest in science? I have concerns about this. Now, you can't always use meaningful gamification. If you're teaching someone a skill, then you're teaching them how to use a hammer. At the end of the day, the hammer is going to be the reward, or the reward is going to be better than being able to use a hammer. Well, then it's not that big of a deal. So if they're teaching them a skill with value, that's okay. If they have no intrinsic motivation to start off with, there's nothing to hurt. It's not so bad. If you've got short-term changes, well, okay, if you're looking for just what's going to happen in the next quarter, it can be useful. But when you want to make a long-term, lifetime change, that's when you want to use meaningful gamification. I look to see places that use this kind of thing. Science museums don't require points or badges to get kids to engage with science. Disney doesn't require people to get involved with world cultures and science. They make playful spaces. They use this concept of participatory museums, has all sorts of ideas of how to get people engaged. And I studied these, and over at that website, you'll find another paper that talks about how to use concepts of participatory museums and play in building this up. But to close out what I wanted to tell you, I wanted to present a recipe that I've created with 6 parts, and these use the letters in the word recipe: reflection, exposition, choice, information, play, and engagement. You can use any of these things to help people find more engagement with what they're doing through gamification. Let me talk about each one. So play. The idea of play is its exploration within limits, that it's optional. You want to give people a space which to explore. You want to create a place for them to experiment and create, but you want to also create a place for them to fail, and they can learn through failure. And that's really hard to do in today's classrooms. It's really hard to create a failure-safe space. That's actually why I like to focus in informal learning spaces like libraries, museums, after-school programs, places where we can frame that learning environment they're having in the classroom by giving them a failure-safe space. Choice. Choice is a key part of self-determination theory. You want to give the players choices to go and explore what they want to pursue and how they're going to be scored towards those different goals. You want to give the control to the players. If you want to use something like badges, it's okay, but the idea is you let the player pick their goal, and then you say, okay, for that goal, here's a path. Here's a set that I can help lead you to that. And so the badges become signposts instead of goalposts. Information. Information is where you give players the why instead of just how many points it's worth. You help them understand what's going on, help them understand their decisions. In Weight Watchers, for example, which is a way that you can lose weight, Weight Watchers has a way of assigning points when you do things, but you can also break down that system and understand, why do foods make me fat? And how can I avoid things that don't make me fat? How do you allow players to find what is relevant? And so this, giving them information, allows them to continue without gamification. Exposition. Adding a narrative can be a valuable metaphor to helping people explore space, but you have to be careful, because a badly chosen narrative can be a distraction from what it is you're trying to bring about, and it can feel like a crappy layer on top of what it is you're trying to reach. Exposition can help set the stage and can help transition players between the different stages of gamification, moving them out of reward systems and into more meaningful stuff, and into actually reflecting about what's going on. Engagement. This is this idea of helping them to engage with other people, using game elements to allow teams to work together, to allow people to find their peers, to create mentorship relations, to create a community of practice through gamification. Helping people to engage with the same system with different perspectives is important to lead you into reflection. Now, Dewey talked about the concept of reflective learning, and this is a failure point in many educational games. Dewey said, if you do stuff, you don't learn it. You have to do stuff, and you have to reflect about it to learn it. So if you have an educational game going on in a classroom and the teacher's leading the reflection, that's okay. But if you have that game experience and the kid's playing at home and there's no moment of reflection and that's not built into the game, then they're not going to learn. And this is another thing. I've got an article on just this concept. How do you bring reflection into educational games at that Because Play Matters site? Because this is so critical. It's a point of failure we have in many of our serious games, is we don't include moments of reflection. Because reflection is a time when you build meaning. It's where you build that internal meaning, where you can connect what you're doing with yourself, where you can understand what was gained, you can understand how you're going to apply things. And reflection is best done with others in some sort of a group setting, and it could be an online group or a dilated group, like I'm doing that in an alternate reality game I made now, where a player reflects, and then they get to see reflections that other people have left behind, so they get to have some reflection. So these are the elements of meaningful gamification: reflection, exposition, choice, information, play, and engagement. Now, you still can use BLAP with some of this. You could create signposts where the user sets the goal, and you help guide them to that goal with badges. You can create moments. BLAP, the leveling systems, can create moments that you know when to give the player more story or more information or make the game more complex. Points can be useful for knowing that the player has achieved a certain level of competency and then they're ready for more. It can be useful for user-created content. It can limit the scope, but let the user create their own content. But think of BLAP as the pathway towards meaningful gamification and not the only reward that you do. So to conclude what we're at here, how do we help users to have and share meaningful moments when they're engaged with gamification? Through autonomy, through competence, and relatedness. If you're not convinced in what I'm having to say here, please take a look at Punish by Rewards or Drive. Those books will give you a lot of examples of how rewards are hurting us. To learn a lot more, you can check out becauseplaymatters.com. And one thing I always like to emphasize, ask gamers for help. Gamers, people who play games and do it as their primary hobby, well, they are ready to help you. They understand what drives them in games, and that it can be a great resource when you're trying to build games for a specific audience. It's engaging the gamers. And that's what we're doing at the library, or at the museum later this week, is we're bringing in users, having them make games in the library, in the museum. I keep messing those things up. Having them make games in the museum because we're trying to engage those users. So that's 20 minutes. I now have some time for questions, but hopefully I've helped you understand that maybe using badges is not the best tool, and there may be some other ways to help engage people through play, through reflection, and through engagement.
Okay, just some rules of engagement. I will pass this mic around, and questions will be into the mic because he has to be able to hear. Scott, can you hear us?
I can hear you, but you do need to speak into the mic. When you're not at the mic, I can't hear what's going on.
Okay, so I'm going to pass that mic around. Could you identify yourself?
Sure. Hi, Scott. This is Kevin Chan. I'm currently developing a couple of apps in education and in fitness and exercise. So, obviously getting people motivated is very important for me. I just had two questions, actually. The first was, could you elaborate a bit more on why leaderboards and rankings you find is not as motivational as people usually feel? And the second question is, if you look at something from a purely commercial perspective, so you're not being altruistic, you just want to make money, you've created an app or a game that just rewards, and you don't really care because the user has effectively purchased that app or will be purchasing it. But do you find, based on your research, taking that sort of approach ultimately will cap your potential audience or stickiness or longevity? Because basically people aren't stupid, right? They'll kind of look through things, and if they feel you're just getting lots of badges, but you're not getting that sort of internal motivation that you talk about, then they'll just sort of dump the game after a couple of weeks or whatever. Thank you.
Okay, so first to talk about the leaderboards. So I ran some experiments last year in my classes where I used gamification methods. And I took the gamification methods that have been presented in the multiplayer classroom book, where you start people at 0 points. You allow them to get points and to go for grades based upon the number of points they've earned. I used leaderboards in these classes and other things like that to experiment with different types of gamification as it was being presented for use in the classroom. Here's what happened with the leaderboards. What I found is that in the leaderboards, in the first couple weeks of class, 3 of the students really got competitive, and they began going up and up and up and getting better and better and better. About a third of the class stayed with them for the first couple weeks and then dropped off. The remainder of the class sat at the bottom of the leaderboard pot, sat at the bottom of the scores. And what I watched, and I've charted this out, and in fact, as I'm saying a lot, there's an article on my Because Play Matters site where I talk through all of this and have the data and the charts, is what you saw is by the end of 6 weeks, you had a few people that were up high. They were inspired by the leaderboards. It worked for them. Everyone else in the class had been flatlining for several weeks. There was no grade improvement. And I did interviews with the students to say, why did you not do anything? And what I heard again and again was, because I couldn't win. I couldn't reach these people. There was no way, so I just gave up trying. In fact, what I found is that if I hadn't stopped the leaderboard project, most of the students were going to drop the class because they had given up so much on this being possible that and so the problem with leaderboards is they are motivating for, there's people above you who are jerks and people below you who you don't care about. There's a chart that shows leaderboards in that way, but they're very dangerous, and there can be better ways to do a leaderboard. One way of doing it is to show where you are in relationship to a couple people that you know or like, because that brings that social connection into it. Then you're not seeing the horde, you're just seeing a few people. Another route is where it shows you just the people right around you. Microsoft does this really well. There's a pinball game, and as you're playing the pinball game, you see the leaderboard, but all you see is the one person ahead of you. And then as you're getting more and more points, and if you beat them, then you see the next person ahead of you. So it creates this micro view. And so what you want to try, if you need to use leaderboards, avoid showing that whole spectrum, because that can be very demotivating. And what I found, my overall takeaway from using gamification in the classes, is it helps strong students to do better, but it created a really loose net that a lot of the weak students fell through. And the students that needed the support didn't find it in these gamification systems. And in fact, they were more demotivating using these reward-based gamification systems. So choice and things like that are great for your strong students, but they can really hurt people that are weak. To your other question about what if you just want to make money? Well, if you think about who makes money in the long term, it's people that have built up loyalty. And the way you build up loyalty is by building up these communities of users. And actually what I'm doing right now, I'm writing a book right now that takes gamification and looks at how do you use gamification to build up communities? Because that's where the long-term value comes from. Same thing with libraries. You know, we see libraries saying, oh, I can put gamification, I see people right away. It's like, yeah, that's this short-term gain, but what about the long-term? Is that something you care about? So I would argue back and say, by building people's loyalty, by building their engagement with your brand, with your product, by getting their involvement, by getting them involved in communities with each other around your product, you're going to have more loyal people for a longer life for your company instead of this quick bang money grab. And as you've said, you know, you say people aren't stupid. Well, I don't know. But you could certainly make a little bit of money, but very quickly they are going to get tired of that reward structure. If you look at long-term engagement with gamification systems that just have basic rewards, you're not seeing a lot of data out there, because I predict it's all short-term. It's short-term immediate grabs, and that's not where you want to be if you're trying to work in serious games. If you're trying to change people in the longer term, you need to think longer term and not short-term.
Hi, I'm Michael from Bullseye. We're a digital agency, so we use gamification for marketing a lot. We also use it for HR purposes. Microphones. So this one, this is way too intense. So I'm just going to stick with one. Sorry. Sorry about that. What I was interested in is actually using badges as signposts, because I'd like to see some real world examples. We never use badges. I think they're a terrible thing, and it's very distracting. People get, like, designers get excited about creating them. Everyone gets excited to look at them the first time, but they cease to have relevance. Particularly, we use gaming and marketing technologies to improve team performance, because marketing is great for getting people enthusiastic and learning about something, and then games are great for continued participation and enjoyment in something. But using badges as a signpost, I think that's a really interesting idea. If you could give me an example of that, would be great.
Okay, so I'll first say that for me, presenting that concept is a bit of a compromise to appease people who feel they have to have rewards in their system. I would prefer to do it like you're doing it, where you get away from rewards and you just have engaging play and game-based activity to get people to do stuff. But if you need those tools, those reward tools. So the idea is that a user says, I want to do this thing. I want to learn this language. I want to have this skill and be developed in this skill. So the badges are really just a way of visualizing what would be a set of lessons that would help them reach that point. So the concept is, and again, it's one of those things. It's like, well, all right, you want to do this. Here are some things you can do, some steps you can take that'll reach you to this. The badges just create a nice, it's kind of like a progress bar, if you will, just a different way of visualizing a progress bar for people that want to see their progress points with actual points and names instead of 87%, 62%, whatever. But it's this idea of they're then used to provide the player with a guide and a visual guide to reach the goal that the player has set. And that's the key part of this is you want the player to say, I want to do this thing. Help me do this thing. Okay, well, here's the steps to reach there. But then when the players reach the goal, they're not just reaching some badge. They're not just reaching some game-related thing. They're reaching something that they wanted to do, that they were driven to do. And that's that. But my preference would be don't use them at all. But if you feel that that's something you need to entice users, what I actually talk about a lot with in this book I'm writing is how you start people off. If you have to start them off with rewards, you develop the reward systems so they are not relevant as the player then gets moved into more meaningful ways of exploring things. So these badges, using that concept, the badges might be a very, very short-term way of getting you engaged with an activity to the point where now you have the skill. Now let's show you what's cool that you can do with that skill that now makes you a creator, that now helps you to engage with other people. And using those reward systems in a very limited fashion, if at all, to just get them in the door, but then move them into these more meaningful spaces and eventually move them into a community. And you get a gold star. Hooray.
Any last questions? Okay, last two.
Hello, Scott. I'm a big fan of your board game. It's called web series.
Oh.
So that's really a pleasure to meet you today. My name is Eko. We have this game design company from Indonesia. And then talk about your gamification style. I'm agree with most of what you said. But my point is, I think the reward is just one piece of the puzzle. I mean, that's how we attract players to play. I mean, that's how we attract players to play. But I always think that the key of this successful gamification concept is when you're able to bring up the internal motivation of the player. It's like you said, I mean, players are the most important thing that in our concept. But the problem is sometimes to be able to bring up this internal motivation, you have to give a bigger room for the player. I mean, so they can contribute to the game. And if we talk about gamification concept, giving bigger room to the players, means we have to tolerate something with our first goal. So how we balance this situation? I mean, if we give room to the player, perhaps they will deviate, far away from our first goal. If we're not giving them enough room, then the game will not so interesting anymore. So how we balance that? That's my
You mean you might allow the player to have fun? to play? Oh dear God, no! They can't play! They have to do exactly what this is actually, if you think back to how I talked about, game designers are used to having this tool of points to control players' behavior. But then think about like Minecraft. Minecraft, they said, let's let people play. Do you get points in Minecraft for doing stuff? No, it's a system. So what I'd suggest and what I talk about is the idea of building a gamification system that allows the players to create and develop their own gamification structures. Theoretically, this actually comes back to something called universal design for learning. And universal design for learning is the idea that you want to let people explore a learning space, taking in content in the way that they are most comfortable taking in content, and demonstrating how they understand content in the way they're most comfortable doing that. And that's how you can help people learn if someone's not good at taking tests, then you come up with other ways for them to demonstrate what they're doing. But you create a system. Same thing with these gamification ideas, that instead of just creating, here's the one true path of gamification, which you must achieve to earn the points, instead you create systems. And where it gets cool is when you make a system with fake boundaries. One of the concepts of play is neat because a person gets to play with boundaries. The concept of play is you're exploring a boundary space. And sometimes you break through those boundaries, and that's when it's really playful. Like when I got up and I looked at the camera, I broke through a boundary with you all. I created something, I broke through a boundary and made something playful. I took this into 3D. And so what you're doing with your players is you create this space and you can create boundaries, but then you can design a system so the player has the ability to break out of that. It's kind of like what Foldit did. Foldit is a tool that allows players to play a game. As they get better at the game, they're solving puzzles that scientists don't have answers for. And the best puzzle solutions gets turned into real protein structures. That's breaking the boundary where it says now what you're doing, we're actually going to make in the real world. So think about how to create boundaries and let people break those boundaries. And thank you for the good words about Board Games with Scott. If you want to learn a lot about board games, go to boardgameswithscott.com. I've talked about 70 videos about modern board games, and I have another one coming out in October of this year called Going, Going, Gone. It breaks boundaries. It's an auction game where you have 5 auctions that are executed simultaneously in 10 seconds.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you for the aspiring presentation. I am also doing research on library and gamification, so I read a lot of your papers. And I think you talk about how to change from the short-term, to make short-term change to long-term change. But I think for library, the real impact on society is to make lifelong learning and to inspire people to make learning for a lifelong activity. So what change to be made if we want to change this from short term to long term and then to lifelong term? And so do you think that gamification really has the potential to make this long-term change in society and in libraries and in literacy, etc.?
So I'll talk about libraries first. One of the problems that libraries have right now is that they are not measuring things to understand the change they're making on society. I work with libraries and I teach classes in library assessment. And one of the things libraries like to measure, how many people come in the door, how many books get checked out. Well, I like to compare that to think about McDonald's. McDonald's says they serve billions and billions of hamburgers. But does that actually tell you how healthy people are from eating at McDonald's? No, not at all. Libraries report statistics like we had 27,000 visitors and they checked out 80,000 books. Does that tell you anything about the difference that they made in society? No, not at all. And the problem with libraries and what they're having right now is they're not thinking about how do you measure the difference that you make in society. Until they figure that one out, then you can't build, because part of when you want to create something to bring about an outcome, you have to know what that outcome is and how you're going to measure it, and then you can create something. Otherwise, you're just guessing. Maybe this will make a difference. So now talking about sort of how the gamification can bring about long-term change and lifelong change. One of the things that I'm talking about in the book I'm writing about this concept is the idea that when you make a gamification system, you're not making it for life. You're making a system that will just be in place long enough to get people engaged in that real world setting, to get them engaged in a community of practice that's supporting that setting. And the gamification then goes away. So you're not creating a cycle. It's not a gamification cycle whatsoever. In fact, the name of the book that I'm working on is called The Gamification Journey, because it's the idea that the gamification takes you on a journey from rewards to meaning to being engaged with the community. And in each step, the gamification is less and less important in having you engage with the real world setting. And from the beginning, you designed the gamification to fade away, to not be important. That can be a really hard pill to swallow for someone who's focused on being a gamification expert and being a consultant in gamification. For that advice to say, yeah, you want to make a system that people don't need after they've been involved for a while, but that's how you get it out of the way. And that, in my opinion, is how you're going to be able to use gamification to make lifelong change, is to be able to get the gamification to make the change and then drop the gamification so people will continue to engage with that world on their own.